I want to thank Deborah and the class committee for inviting me. I do admit that I was a bit surprised to field an invitation to speak at the class of '68. Of course, my reunion is not until next year, but it does feel great to be here among my much, much older fellow graduates. McCormick Auditorium, too. The rest of the building's changed, but this hasn't changed much. And as for most of you, I remember my first freshman class was Western Civilization, taught in this very place. I hear now it's a class in current events called The End of Western Civilization as We Know It. I don't think I'll be asked to speak at my own reunion next year, though our reunion chairman, Ann Chipman's at the back there, shaking her head, no, I won't be. As I'm sure you will all agree, the class of '68 was always brainier, more serious, more buttoned down than the class of '69, which was mostly a bunch of drug-addled idiots. But we did know how to have more fun. There's no way a formal bureaucrat will be their reunion teacher. In fact, Ann has told me that the subject for the speaker next year is legalizing marijuana? Why take out all the fun? So, yeah, let's see if this works. Why am I here? Good question. The title of my speech, which I did not select, is The Big Short, which means you were probably expecting some exciting story about Wall Street greed delivered by a great-looking Brad Pitt kind of guy. Well, only half right. I admit to the Brad Pitt look. But I spent 25 years as a trial attorney at the Securities and Exchange Commission. You don't expect me to cater to a bunch of senior Lake Forest graduates by dumbing down my presentation. You guys are smart. I know you're smart. So I know you want to hear about the intricacies of a synthesized, collateralized debt instrument comprised of mortgage-backed securities. There you go. That's what you want. I spent hours putting together this great illustration of what that was and what the Goldman Sachs, what the SEC and the Department of Justice investigated to almost no avail. This is how it works. My mouth waters at discussing this, but my wife, who could not be here today, but in that way wives have of stripping your pretense and telling you what's really going on, suggested this detailed discussion might be a little dry. But the class of '68 is really, really smart, I said. And she replied, if they are really, really smart, they'll walk out of there before you barely get started. So I tried to make it more palatable, and fortunately, coming from the class of '69, I figured, well, I'll make this as the class of '69 would appreciate it. There it is. It's kind of reduced in complexity for you. This deal that I had on the board earlier was called Abacus. It was a $1 billion fraud, that's a B with a billion, fraud perpetrated by Goldman Sachs on unsuspecting institutional investors. I worked on the SEC case, which ended up with a $550 million fine against Goldman Sachs. It was one of many civil suits brought by the SEC against big Wall Street banks after the crash of 2008, and one of many criminal investigations brought by the Department of Justice. Those agencies got some big headlines with fines that, to the average guy, seemed pretty large. So here are some examples from the Wayback Machine. That wasn't all. State attorneys general and class action suit lawyers got in on the action. Lawyers in private practice made a lot of money. Other banks and institutional investors who suffered losses by investing in crooked deals sold by these banks got at least some of their money back. Even the big banks themselves that paid what many regarded as large fines for their misconduct were essentially made whole by the federal government bailout, which they eventually were able to repay. So they suffered losses mostly in reputation, and the shareholders paid for the fines. But what's a reputation on Wall Street nowadays? Is it better to be an honest guy or a slick operator? Maybe I'm too cynical, but I think the answer seems clear. Now, has anybody spotted two things wrong with this picture of bad guys being brought to the bar of justice? First, there are no guys, or women either. There are no individuals who were prosecuted individually, as individuals, either civilly or criminally, for the crash of 2008, with two small exceptions. There are also damn few real victims, your average citizen, who got any compensation. In fact, to the extent the average guy or gal got sucked into a mortgage he or she couldn't pay, invested in a mutual fund or bought stocks directly or through an IRA or a pension fund, he and she got screwed by the Great Recession. If they were shareholders in one of the big banks, they also paid the fines and the money damages, which came out of operating funds, reducing profits and dividends. So far as I can determine, and I've followed this closely over the years, only two actual people employed by Wall Street banks ever were named defendants by the SEC or the Department of Justice as a result of the financial crash. One was a 27-year-old Frenchman who worked on the trading desk at the New York office of Goldman Sachs, the case I worked on. He was just a vice president, the title banks give to guys just hired off the street. The SEC sued him at my behest, at least I got a little something, and he went to trial, ended up being fined about $185,000. Then he went to the University of Chicago, got an advanced degree, and I think is teaching there now. His name was Fabrice Tour. The other guy was named Karim Serigaldin. He was not too low level, not as low level as Tour, but a little higher up at Credit Suisse. He entered a criminal plea and was sentenced to 30 months in prison. He also was fined $1 million by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Serigaldin's treatment only shows that it can be done. It is possible to prosecute people higher up the food chain at these banks. But in fact, on both an absolute and per capita basis, more top bankers were jailed by Iceland and Britain than in the United States. And it was the United States bankers who pretty much placed the explosives and lit the fuse on the worldwide financial crisis. Interesting, by the way, that one of our four individual defendants was French and the other was Egyptian. We can say that no American citizen was ever brought to the bar of justice from the big Wall Street banks. So here's the balance sheet for the legal action, civil, criminal, government, and private, all of it as a result of the crash. Bank fines, $243 billion, which again, shareholders paid. Total individuals prosecuted civilly and criminally who were employed by those big banks, too. Are you pissed off yet? Well, I am, and I was. I worked in the bowels of one of the main agencies that was supposed to enforce the securities laws and police Wall Street. In my view, shared by many at the SEC at the time, but spoken publicly only by me, the government failed in its mandate to enforce the law. I know for a fact the SEC laid off investigating the matter I was most directly involved with, the sale by Goldman Sachs of the fraudulent scam called Abacus. And I know it did the same thing with the other big bank cases it brought without naming any individual bank employees. Other attorneys at the SEC on those cases, who I shared general office space with, complained about it internally, as did I. Their investigations also were shortened, reduced, compared to even a $200,000 insider trading case, which the SEC would investigate the hell out of. I was also surprised that the Department of Justice, which brings criminal cases for fraud, brought none against the individuals at the Wall Street banks other than that Egyptian guy. It too extracted fines that were pretty large, but hardly damaging, from the likes of Goldman, Citibank, Morgan Stanley, and Bank of America. For a little of your background, the SEC brings civil cases for insider trading, corporate fraud, and all kinds of other financial frauds having to do with the securities business. The SEC can't send folks to jail, but it can make life pretty unpleasant for individuals and corporations alike by investigating the hell out of them, making them hire lawyers, produce documents, and sit for hours of interviews and testimony under oath. And that's just for the investigation. If cause is found, the SEC can sue for return of any profits and for financial penalties. The SEC can ban entities, including banks, if necessary, and individuals, from participating in the securities markets. Least effective, but most commonly used, the SEC can get court injunctions telling a defendant not to violate the law again. Injunctions which, in practice, are ignored by both sides. The SEC often works closely with the Department of Justice in Washington and with U.S. attorney offices across the country to bring parallel criminal actions for violations of the securities laws and other statutes. So the power is there. The power is provided, but it has to be used. I tried to let the public know, and I failed. Later, I found out that lawyers in the Justice Department also pushed to get stronger enforcement. They failed too. This is made clear by a recent book that Deborah Stanley read, as she said earlier, causing her to bring all of us here together in the leafy confines of Lake Forest College. My experiences are recounted in one chapter. Most of the book is about the Justice Department, which is appropriate since those folks, as I said, can send people to jail, even though they didn't. Now, as recounted in the book, I got the Goldman case on my desk in July of 2009. It was a memo that summarized the investigation undertaken to date by young, inexperienced staff, only about 4 lawyers. Because the matter was likely to result in a complaint and maybe down the road a trial, I got a copy of this memo, which recommended a lawsuit be filed against Goldman Sachs to be approved by the 5 commissioners of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I saw right away it was a great case. If you recall, the housing market was going nuts in the 2000s. That was at least partly because mortgages were given to hundreds of thousands of people who in any rational world did not qualify for them. Responsibility for selling the mortgages or peddling the mortgages, recruiting people to get a mortgage, was totally divorced from the responsibility for giving or paying back the loan. So mortgage brokers, both at big responsible mortgage bank institutions and at fly-by-night places, would get a commission for selling the mortgage. And then they'd otherwise be gone. They weren't around to clean up the mess. So responsibility was separated. The brokers themselves were usually the type who previously were offering gym memberships and cruises by telephone. In their office banter, as they laughed at how easy it was to get people to get a mortgage for a flea bag, a mansion, or some structure in between, they created names. One of my favorite that I learned during the investigation was a NINA loan, which means N-I-N-A loan. No income, no assets. That meant the applicant had no income and no assets, but he'd get a mortgage anyway. The mortgage usually had a low introductory rate that adjusted to much higher levels after a few months or a year. Or sometimes the mortgage required a big balloon payment after a relatively short time. Of course, when the interest rate rose or the balloon payment came due, that's when the borrower, who had moved his family into a house that he really could not afford, had to default. Billionaire hedge fund operator John Paulson, no relation to then Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, saw that the mortgage market was way overheated and abused. He wanted to take advantage of what he properly perceived would be a dramatic collapse in the market. In other words, he wanted to short the housing market. He found a way to do so with Goldman's help. They created a product that was a derivative, basically just an instrument on which to wager about the likely future of the housing market, and the mortgage was financing this incredible bubble. I can get into details, but as that earlier chart showed you, it would bore the hell out of you. Suffice it to say, Paulson went to 2 other investment banks before he went to Goldman. They rejected his plan as too toxic. Basically, Paulson would pick the mortgage bonds to bet on. He would pick the ones he thought most likely to fail. Goldman would package those selections into a security. Paulson would take the short side, i.e. betting on the product to fail, and Goldman would sell the long side as a decent security, no guarantees, but certainly an okay security offered for sale by the distinguished Wall Street firm of Goldman Sachs. And it found innocent large institutions to do that. The biggest investor was actually a German bank. So you can tell how the kinds of frauds perpetrated on Wall Street can infect investors in other countries. In this case, IKB, which was a German bank. Goldman would not tell the long side investors that the product had been put together to fail by a guy who was taking the short. In other words, this was a clear scheme to defraud in violation of the securities laws as well as common law fraud, morality, and basic business integrity. In order to keep my mind focused on the fraud while other people kept bringing up the complexities that layer over it, I posted this on my office wall. It wasn't in pink, but it looks better this way. Now, for those of you who aren't versed in anything about Wall Street, I'll bore the rest of you with what it means to go short. When a group of people decide, it's not illegal to short. First, let me say that. When a group of people decide to incorporate to make widgets, it is assumed they want to make money and have their shareholders make money on a successful widget. So there's nothing illegal about shorting that. If you think the widget company stock is overpriced and or the company is likely to fail, you can borrow the stock at the current market price level and basically pay it back with stock purchased when the price falls. Of course, if the price goes up, then you take the loss. So in theory, these exotic derivatives were not much different. One side takes the short and one side takes the long. The difference with Abacus was, as I said, the short put the product together, so he selected those bonds that he thought would fail. It was not designed to succeed, it was designed to fail. The Abacus offering was closed in April 2008. Before the end of that year, 90% of the mortgages in the bonds had defaulted. Investors lost, as I said earlier, about $1 billion. Paulson realized $1 billion. Goldman got about $17 million for underwriting the deal. If this description still is too complicated, try this. Paulson mixed the poison. Goldman knowingly mislabeled it as castor oil. Kids died. Well, of course, kids didn't die directly from Abacus, though a lot of families certainly suffered from the mortgage problem. But there is identifiable damage from it and similar schemes which, if they didn't cause the mortgage collapse, they certainly aggravated it. They leveraged the damage that the mortgage collapse caused. And what we ended up with was, as you can see, $19 trillion in household wealth lost, 30% drop in housing prices, 8.8 million American jobs lost, 10 million homes lost. With a few important differences, the Abacus scam was pretty much the same story for products sold at other banks like Bank of America and Morgan Stanley. Multiplied many times over, as I said, it aggravated the damage that had resulted from the mortgage crisis. So in July of 2009, I was excited to read about this obvious fraud. The facts were pretty much admitted by a guy employed by Paulson, though he didn't admit it was fraud. But the recommendation to the Securities and Exchange Commission from the staff was to sue only Goldman Sachs, the institution, the bank. No individuals were to be named. And more of a surprise to me, The investigation had stopped cold at the lowest level, down at the trading desk. There was no attempt to interview or take a testimony under oath of others. Even Paulson had not been called to testify. I had seen this movie before, only to a much lesser extent. It was a political investigation. The public was clamoring for action to hold someone or something responsible for the crash that happened less than a year before. The notion was to get out a complaint fast. Goldman was the first. The hell with taking time to find out what humans were responsible. Bring a lawsuit, get a big fine, and issue a glowing press release. Prove your government is in action. The SEC is acting as the tough cop on Wall Street. Proclaim it from the rooftops. Then stop. Rinse and repeat with the other banks. I had never seen such a major fraud, $1 billion in a single fraud, where the investigation was cut off so quickly. Long story short, I pushed and I pushed and I pushed to expand the investigation. Some of it's recounted in the Chicken Shit Club. I got the staff to name the French guy. At least we had one guy, one warm body, who was most hands-on, but by far not the only guy hands-on working with Paulson and creating Abacus. But he obviously had no authority to put through $1 billion deal. Well, and even Goldman Sachs recognizes $1 billion is a lot of money. And they realized 17 million, maybe not that big, but still a lot of money. A lot of people were involved. Emails produced by Goldman and by the Paulson Fund disclosed dozens of Goldman personnel were aware of the nature of Abacus. They were not even questioned by the SEC. The resistance from the front office to naming Paulson a defendant was intense. Although Paulson was eventually questioned under oath after my pushing, and although he or his assistant picked the lousy bonds that created the lousy investment and got the $1 billion gain, the response was, but he was just a customer. Yes, he was a customer. He was also a co-conspirator with Goldman personnel, far higher up than just the poor 27-year-old Fabrice Tour in a huge fraud. And as I said, this was repeated in other bank cases that I was fairly well aware of because the trial lawyers were in my office. I never got a straight answer from anyone why the investigation was so incomplete. I knew from experience that, like I mentioned earlier, insider trading cases for a few $100,000 were investigated far more aggressively. I tried a case once on a 5th level tippee. In other words, there was an insider who tipped a guy, who tipped a guy, who tipped a guy, who tipped my defendant, who was a high school dropout who ran a scaffold company in Brooklyn, so far removed from any corporate insider as to be totally laughable. We took him to a jury trial in Brooklyn where he defended himself. Not one of my greatest victory, but still a victory. So it's been years since when I first got there in the 90s. It went after, or in the 80s rather, the Mike Milkins and the Ivan Boskis and the First Jersey Securities and others. And that was also Rudy Giuliani's highlight before he got all crazy and political. And he was the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. And there was a lot going on. Those were under Republican presidents, too. Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Now, the only explanation I ever heard, it's not an explanation, was that when Jesse Eisinger, the author of the book, also wrote an online New Yorker article about the SEC, he quoted the guy who was the head of the Division of Enforcement as saying, who by then had moved into private practice again, we are proud of the work we did at the SEC. That's all I got. Now let me be clear. I cannot claim that anyone besides Fabrice Tour at either Goldman or Paulson and Company or to any of these other banks were guilty of a scheme to defraud. Since there was no serious investigation, there is no admissible evidence. There is no conclusion. There are no defendants. People were not asked to tell their stories and what they knew under oath. and everyone is innocent until proven guilty. Not only have the bad guys got off the hook, but the lesson to Wall Street has been that crime definitely pays. You might get fined, your company might get fined, but as the book title says, as the chapter of my book says, it's just a toll on the bankster turnpike, a cost of doing business that comes out of earnings for shareholders, not executive bonuses. This chart shows that the destruction of the world economy and driving many Americans from a middle-class life into poverty caused barely a hiccup in the delivery of bonuses to Wall Street. As important, perhaps, the story of what really happened to blow up the economy at what really happened at Goldman and other places, as well as many other places in the economy, of course, including mortgage companies. Those lessons are lost to history because they weren't investigated. What really happened? And in fact, there's much evidence that most of the folks on Wall Street have not even changed their reckless practices. Ownership of derivatives by too big to fail banks and their customers is far above what it was in 2008. Now, thanks to millennials who have a justified skepticism nowadays about getting a mortgage, fewer of the derivatives are involved in the mortgage business and are elsewhere. But derivatives are a risky product. They do serve a purpose in many instances, though not abacus. And they are high risk and high reward. Just like the tables at a casino. And it's particularly great when you can go to the casino and use other people's money. As for me, I did not exactly become a pariah at the SEC, but I got bounced from the Goldman case. I actually got assigned to another big case. Fannie Mae. As contrasted to the Goldman case, the investigation of Fannie Mae, which by now was in government receivership, so effectively the government, the taxpayer, was paying both sides of this investigation. No expense was spared investigating this case. The charge was that Fannie Mae had failed to disclose how weak the mortgage bonds were that it was offering to investors, and it too had knowingly endorsed bad loans to poor people. Republicans like to blame Fannie and its sister agency, Freddie Mac, for causing the crash. They preferred to blame them rather than any Wall Street entities. The investigation of both Fannie and Freddie went on for months, employing perhaps 15 or 20 staff and at times more, obtaining millions of documents, taking dozens of depositions. I was still angry over Goldman and marveled at how political the SEC had become. The SEC eventually sued 3 Fannie executives and a couple more for Freddie Mac. It was an overblown case. A few years later, after I'd left, the commission entered into a face-saving settlements with both executives at both agencies. Had these resources been used on Wall Street banks, I would not be here talking to you today, and some senior executives would have been jailed and otherwise forced to find another line of work. As I would describe shortly, some did find another line of work in government. I couldn't put Goldman behind me. I felt there was a myriad of failures by government, politicians, businessmen, and journalists. Not just regarding Goldman, but the whole financial mess. The Great Recession was caused by individuals, at least in large part. Yes, they acted through big institutions, but ultimate responsibility lies with those who make the decisions. Yes, responsibility is dispersed across the economy, but conspiracies to defraud are hatched by individuals in each office. Each scheme is slightly different, but the goal is the same: rig the deck and steal from the suckers. But at the SEC, and as I later learned from Eisinger's book at the Department of Justice, leadership almost entirely imported from Wall Street law firms had used kid gloves on people who were former and maybe future clients. And where was journalism? There were some commentaries asking why no one was going to jail, but nothing that I, as a reporter for 10 years, including 2 years as editor of the Stenner, by the way, and that I thought of as investigators, and I was married to a reporter who was a reporter for 50 years, thought of as an investigative or even very critical reporting. Reporters were put off by politically appointed people at DOJ and the SEC saying, well, these are complicated securities, or there were sophisticated investors on both sides. The complexity was phony. It was still selling snake oil. And even sophisticated investors expect a seller with a Wall Street pedigree to be recommending a product he believes is at least a reasonably sound investment or will disclose its failures and flaws. Plus, there's nothing in the securities laws that makes it a defense to gross fraud that the victim was sophisticated. I asked myself, how could the press accept, even grudgingly, that no one was responsible for billion-dollar frauds? But where do I go? At first, both Congress and the White House were in Democrat hands. So Democrats wouldn't go after the administration. After 2 years, as I worried on about this, Republicans controlled Congress, and while they would love to attack the administration, they didn't want to attack Wall Street. The tribalism we see today in politics and government was well underway by 2010. Republicans weren't going to push Wall Street fat cats into jail, and Democrats were not going to make the Obama administration look weak. And both then and now, both parties receive large contributions from Wall Street bankers, corporate executives, and plutocrats of every stripe. In fact, I just saw a story the other day that Wall Street is betting on Democrats right now with its contributions. I did not want to lose my job, or more important, at my age, my pension. I was 63 years old. My daughter was on her own, but still needed financial help. My wife was retired after, as I said, nearly 50 years in journalism. Her pension was pathetic. She was worried I might do something rash. But I was angry, but I was also scared. Also, I was and am a lawyer. I had obligations to my client. Everything I knew was privileged information if it was not already public. Not only could I lose my job if I went public, but also lose my law license. But who was my client? Was it the self-serving cowards at the SEC looking to move on to return to their Wall Street job? Or was it the tax-paying public? Who was my client? Was I so in fear of one that I could not serve the other? Those are the things that troubled me. I made one effort to get the story out. I wrote a letter to the New York Times detailing how poorly the SEC had investigated not just Goldman, but also Bank of America and Morgan Stanley. I sent 5 copies to different reporters and editors in New York. I used only publicly available information, aware of my legal obligation to confidentiality, but I showed the Times reporters how the SEC had failed to investigate Goldman and the other bank cases. I told how veteran employees pushed to expand the work to question higher-ups, but the political appointees and those they appointed had throttled the inquiries without even offering reasons, or at least any reasons that made sense. I told the Times I was employed by the SEC, but my letter was anonymous. I put on a fake return address. I sent out 5 separate copies via express mail. Nothing happened. No sign of investigative reporting. I was completely discouraged. I gave up. I just groused at the office. I learned months after my retirement that the letters supposedly never reached the New York Times. I had used the newspaper's old address, only a block from their new one. I'm a little skeptical, but I have no evidence, so another failure, this time on my part. So I got really lousy cases, small potatoes stuff that someone with my record, I'd never lost a case that I tried, and experience should not have been given, but I understood. I was an annoyance on both the Goldman matter and the Fannie Mae case. On the one hand, I was deemed too aggressive. On the other, I was deemed too skeptical. I was not a team player. So I was bounced from the team. I was never as enthusiastic about work again. A new chairman of the commission came on board, Mary Jo White, who had won a good reputation as a U.S. attorney back in the 90s, but had spent the last 20 years representing Wall Street defendants at a big white shoe law firm. These defendants included Citibank, Bank of America, and J.P. Morgan. Her pitch was that the SEC should pursue a broken windows theory of law enforcement, popular for street crime under Mayor Bloomberg. White gave speeches about how the SEC went after those low-level crooks. If they did that, the big guys would take notice and behave. I nearly threw up each time I heard that speech. If you were a big guy on the 50th or 100th executive suite floor, figuratively looking out the window and seeing the small fry getting nabbed on the street by the SEC cops, you're going to laugh and say, "Keep at it, SEC. Just don't take the elevator to see what's going on up here." Say this for White. She was out front expressing how the SEC had come to operate by this time. I spent another 2 years or so at the commission after being booted from the big team. I had a trial in San Francisco, insider trading case against another small potatoes guy. We won. It was fun, as they usually are if you win. But soon afterwards, my wife of 38 years died unexpectedly. These kinds of events make you look at what's important about your life and what is not. I retired in March 2014, 6 months after Sarah died. I decided that however I was going to spend the rest of my life, it was better than pursuing small fry unfairly, knowing my agency would let the big guys escape. Chairman White returned to her lucrative private practice after the 2016 election, although she had said when nominated that she would not expect to do so. Presumably, she is now counseling big banks on how to escape the weak clutches of the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Rob Khuzami, the division director at the time of these bank investigations, left the SEC when White took over. He reportedly got a $6 or $7 million package to be a partner at Kirkland & Ellis, a big law firm. For reasons I don't know, last year he left there and went back to the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York. You may have seen him on TV recently announcing the plea deal with the president's lawyer, Michael Cohen. No knock on him for presumably heading that well-deserved investigation, but the lesson I take away is that there are talented lawyers who will go all out, even to get the President of the United States and his friends, but run scared of big Wall Street firms with their multi-million-dollar counsel. As I said, I never got a reason from Khuzami why he let off Goldman and the other firms. Maybe the fact that he previously, before being at the SEC, was at Deutsche Bank, and then he went to be a big white shoe defense lawyer for Wall Street after his tenure at the SEC, might explain it. But maybe I'm too skeptical. It's an old and continuing story about how the levers of American government are pulled by those with built-in conflicts of personal and professional interest. It doesn't matter so much which party is in power. Maybe the Democrats do a little more that's responsive than the Republicans claim to do. The jersey colors change, but in some areas, like law enforcement, often the game is the same. Obama's Treasury Secretary in his second term was Jack Lew, who was Chief Operating Officer for the division of Citibank that collapsed the bank in 2008. Did Jack Lew have a hand in the fraud? We don't know. I can assume not. These are big places. But without any investigation and no public disclosure, who really knows who was responsible? If you are alert to it, you can find government law enforcement failure and lies often. Last week, I was listening to a podcast about Purdue Pharmaceuticals and how a U.S. Attorney's Office in Virginia wanted to indict the company and its senior officers for pushing OxyContin as non-addicting and ignoring the way the company turned a blind eye or encouraged doctors to overprescribe, sometimes thousands of pills over. When the prosecutors went to Maine Justice for approval of a serious criminal indictment of the executives, Rudy Giuliani dropped by the Maine office representing Purdue and got the Bush administration to substantially weaken the charges to misdemeanors for the corporate officers. The investigative records remain sealed, so the public doesn't know the full story of that investigation. In 8 years of the Obama administration, efforts to unseal the materials were to no avail. Meanwhile, civil service suffers. Civil servants are targets of abuse by Republicans and most of the public. You get bad service from some bureaucrat or hounded by the IRS, you grouse how lazy and overpaid are the bureaucrats. Again, if you look, there are signs everywhere of how politics stifles good civil servants. Last week I heard about OxyContin. This week there's a new book by Michael Lewis that's getting good reviews, who wrote The Big Short book. His newest is about how bright people at Commerce, Agriculture, and the EPA are kept from doing their jobs by political appointees under Trump. Sure, there are deadbeats, but most, especially at the levels requiring professional skills, just try to do a good job on behalf of the taxpayer. So I retired, pretty much sick of the whole charade, but I went out with a bang. I gave a retirement speech that didn't hold back. And I got a good round of applause from the 80 or so SEC employees who were there, who sent me off. Here's an excerpt of my theme. I'll give you a minute to look at it. I hope you find it funny. That's part of it. Much to my surprise, the speech got put on the internet. You can find it there now if you want to. Look up James Kidney and SEC, and somewhere along there there's the speech. Bloomberg, the online New York Times Deal Book, and other outfits, some just obscure internet sites, picked up the theme. Some of them laid it out in pretty funny ways. That's my 15... Didn't accomplish anything, but it was funny. So I had 15 nanoseconds of publicity. Gave an interview to PBS, or public broadcasting rather. But that was pretty much it. Didn't accomplish anything. And after I left, I offered some materials to the Bernie Sanders campaign, but they suggested I give it to Elizabeth Warren's office. I did. I never heard what they did with it. Probably nothing. As we were reminded during the Kavanaugh brouhaha, party loyalty is usually triumphant in Washington. The investigative failures I know of were all on the Obama watch, but giving this stuff to Warren did make me an official whistleblower. So when I got a call from the IG's office at the SEC to come in and talk, I said, no, I don't think so. I said, well, we think you took this. We know you took this stuff. And I said, yeah, I gave it to Elizabeth Warren. The guy said, so you consider yourself a whistleblower? I said, yeah. I never heard from him again. So hopefully I won't. So I've run on plenty long enough. My God, we don't have near as much time as I thought we'd have for questions. And I see some of you in this elderly crowd long ago fell asleep. I can't blame you. It's the old among, not just the old among us have short attention spans. I heard somewhere that screen-obsessed people have the attention span of a goldfish. So, of course, nothing changed as a result of my meager efforts. But whistleblowing has not been without its reward, and there is an LFC tie-in. A year or two ago, I got an email from one of my LFC classmates, Bob Armistead. Some of you may remember him. I'd not seen him in years, though we occasionally communicate through Facebook. Bob is retired and for fun plays with a pickup bluegrass string band with gigs in New York City. He emailed me that the bass player, during a performance at an Irish bar, worked at the SEC. He asked her if she had heard of me, and she replied that he's a hero at the SEC. That was news to me. But being called a hero by a lass at an Irish bar, I think that's quite a reward. Plus, your generosity in letting me share with you in your 50th reunion is also a considerable reward. Thank you. So this took way longer than when I delivered it for practice. But hopefully it was worth it. And if anybody has any questions or comments, anything? Sorry I took so much time.
What's your opinion of the too large to fail excuse for the bailout?
Well, I think there's a question of focus. It's true that these large banks, George W. Bush faced the imminent collapse of the commercial paper market back in 2008. Something had to be done to secure greater confidence in our financial markets. Companies of many sizes and many stripes rely on 2-week and 30-day commercial paper to meet payroll. It helps smooth income versus costs. That's a very, very important and little known function of our securities markets. And some of this financial crisis was causing people not to extend that kind of credit. So they had to do something. And the bailout was what they had to do. It's too bad that there weren't more conditions attached to it, such as making some of these individuals pay, or at least putting restrictions on bonuses, lots of other things. Now, from a regulatory point of view, I think it wouldn't be so bad if some of these banks suffered a hit. Not all of them at the same time. But instead of also just focusing on Dodd-Frank type relief, how about putting people in jail? It was said at the time by people saying, why not put some people in jail? Jail is an alien territory to people who are high up in Wall Street banks. They don't hang out with people who went to jail. They don't go to jail. They don't think of jail. It's quite a fall to risk jail. And I think you need to rely on your law enforcement people. You need to get them to be tougher, to investigate further, to be more critical, to be more skeptical of the defenses that the Wall Street lawyers are paid to bring to them. Because you can jail people without destroying the financial system. Nobody's indispensable. And I think that I'm not expert enough to know what kind of rules and regulations should be imposed on the banks. Sometimes the simplest answer is also the best answer. And I think making people feel individually responsible for being honest will go a long way, not just in the financial system, but in many systems. We take a kid, it's often been said, it's not news to you, you take a kid who robs a 7-Eleven and he goes to prison for a couple of years. If the kid stole $1 billion, you could hire a good lawyer and probably get off. So I think it's a problem that is not just common to the Department of Justice and the SEC. It, to some extent, is systemic and not new. Anybody else?
Is this on? No. Okay. My question is, what did you conclude about Glass-Steagall as a result of all of this?
Well, there's some controversy over Glass-Steagall. For those of you who don't know, Glass-Steagall was a Depression-era law that kept commercial banks from investing depositor funds in securities. And it was repealed under the Clinton administration. The argument was that big American banks needed to get bigger and had to compete against big European banks, and that this would help them. I think it would be good if we passed a new Glass-Steagall. There are people who say Glass-Steagall had nothing to do with it, but I've never understood that argument. And I think it would be really good to perhaps take these biggest banks and get them out of this kind of risky business. They can invest their own capital, their own earnings, but not that of shareholders, of depositors.
Jim, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and unique insight into all this. Can you comment on the credit agencies? I imagine Abacus was AAA rated.
Yeah, the credit agencies are an interesting story. Standard & Poor's, Moody's, they're the two big ones. And a company will take their bonds, the debt that they want to issue, or the securities that may be made up of that debt, and take it to a Moody's or Standard & Poor's. The issuer pays Moody's and Standard & Poor's, and Standard & Poor's supposedly reviews this and gives what's supposed to be a objective rating of the credit quality. And yes, most of these mortgage bonds were rated AAA or AA, which is still investment grade, when they weren't. The SEC investigated Standard & Poor's for several years after the crash and decided not to bring an action. I don't know why. I wasn't involved in that. I'd left by the time the decision was made, but I know they spent years on it. How focused and how many resources were devoted to it, I don't know. Let's just say the S&P case was left open. Many people were critical of Standard & Poor's. Nothing was done. There was talk about having a special ratings agency to rate the raters, in effect. Okay, well, I'm not sure if the SEC was in charge of rating the raters, that the result would have been very different. But to my knowledge and recollection, if anybody knows anything else, nothing was ever done. So you still have Standard & Poor's and Moody's, and there have been a couple of newer rating agencies, small fry, I think, come on board, saw an opportunity. But, the people who want to issue the security are not the best ones to be paying for the rating. It's pretty obvious. A lot of what goes on Wall Street is obvious if you get rid of all the complexity. The securities laws, if you ever sat down and read them front to back, well, you're a stronger person than I am. They are complex. Some parts seem to contradict other parts. If we had a better political climate, you'd tear the whole structure down and start over. But that's nothing anyone would recommend now in this era of economic inequality, tribalism, anger. That would just become chum for lobbyist sharks. It would be a nightmare. So we have to wait for a better time to do that, but that would be something good to do. So it's, that's sort of what I have to say about that. Thanks. Well, let's see. I got the memo on July 30th, 2009, and I'd say they brought the case, they filed a lawsuit in March, I think, of 2010. So I was with the case until then. I was a good trial lawyer. I was expected to take lead on trying the case if it went to trial. It did eventually settle. But they came around and told me, Jim, you're not going to be the lead counsel. You get to handle the experts. Well, I knew that was, you're off the, they wanted me to get off the case. So I obliged. So really, it was amazing. It went from, it was about a year, I think, between the start of the investigation and till bringing the complaint, which is like light speed for the SEC. And I think the result sort of proves that. Well, I think that we have to be aware that the leading economy still in the world, and what we do impacts everywhere. People want to invest in the United States. I mean, who knows what's going to happen down the road, but we're in kind of unusual times. But I remember reading and seeing even on TV, I remember, I think I got this right, sticks in my brain, about some small town in Sweden where it was Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or somebody, drove his car up to the town council office and sold him on a really crappy investment that was based on U.S. mortgages. And that sank the town. I mean, how much regulation is too much? How much regulation is too little? How much is regulation appropriate? If you have regulation and you don't enforce the law, who gives a damn? You're still going to get your bonus. You're still going to go home to your wife and kids. You're still going to show up for work 9 to 5. You're still going to get kudos from all the guys who work around you for pulling off this great deal. Your life doesn't change. It does. And I like to think maybe my attitude is just cynicism from my experience, but I don't think so. Like I said, you open your eyes and you see this kind of stuff happening all the time at state level, county level, federal level. But to see it on $1 billion deal, one little guy, I mean, if you can get away with that, you can get away with anything. Well, if they did, that was stupid, because people can be replaced. It's not like anybody was, even Lloyd Blankfein, who was the president of Goldman or chairman of Goldman for many years, he just stepped down. They had a guy to replace him. Everybody can be replaced. I was at a little forum for investigative journalists a few weeks ago, and Jim Risen, who was a well-known investigative journalist for the New York Times, until the New York Times decided not to support him on a national security issue that he was going to be prosecuted for or held in contempt for not disclosing his source. But I was sitting next to him. He's now with something called The Intercept, which I think is a Glenn Greenwald thing, if you've heard of him. But it's an online deal. But he asked me, he said, are you sure that the Obama administration didn't just agree to this because both the SEC and Justice laid off? And I said, well, maybe. I don't know. I don't have any proof of it. A friend of mine is a reporter for the Washington Post, still is. And she, I don't know whether, I'm sure this was off the record, but apparently Obama, like Nixon did, my wife, who was a reporter for 50 years, went to some Nixon dinners after Nixon was out of office. He'd like to invite a handful of reporters up and he'd pontificate and stuff. Well, apparently Obama has at least occasionally invited some reporters in. We're off the record. And this meeting was one of the times out of many when Trump was grousing about Sessions. And Obama, as I get it, and I don't think she was quoting directly, was sort of saying that Obama said he felt similarly constrained about Wall Street, which is self-serving nonsense. The President of the United States, right now, this president, would be intruding on an investigation about him and his campaign. There would have been nothing wrong that I can see from the President of the United States suggesting to his Attorney General or even the chairman of the SEC, an independent agency, I'd like you to be a little tougher on Wall Street crooks. Can you do that? I don't know whether it'd have a different outcome. But that's not anything unethical. It's being the chief administrator of your administration and trying to direct your employees in a way that is independent of any personal interest you have. So that's all I've heard. I don't know. I'll tell you the hardest thing to do, that there's a new third rail of politics. It used to be Social Security and Medicare. Now, among my liberal friends, and I'm a liberal, criticizing Obama is the third rail. You just can't do that. So, and but by contrast, Obama, you don't want to hear me start on my politics, but he at least is lucky that he got to be the president between two of the worst we ever had, so that helps. I'm sorry I've taken up a lot of your time, and I appreciate your tolerance, and if there are no more, I'm happy to talk to anybody after. Thank you.